in order to stimulate the economy out of this recession is going to ignite a powder keg. We already have an inflation problem, and Powell's going to pour all this gasoline on it. And so we're going to see inflation moving up to a much higher level, even though it's already very high.
You think that inflation is not done rising? It's going to go above 9.1%. Peter, I just want to point out the fact that in no prior recession over the last 70 years has inflation risen during a recession. This time's going to be different?
Yes, well, as they keep telling us, this is a very unique recession. In fact, most people don't even want to admit that we have one.
Okay.
But, you know, look at the recessions of the 1970s. You had rising prices there, you know, during stagflation, and that's what my forecast is. Remember, last year, I was predicting the U.S. economy would be in recession in the first half of 2022, and very few people had that right. But I also predicted that inflation wasn't transitory, that it would get stronger as the economy got weaker, and that is exactly what happened. Now, the reason that I believe that inflation is going to kick into a higher gear as this recession that we are in gets worse is because I believe Powell is going to pivot ultimately, and he is going to give up his fight against inflation in order to fight a different foe, and that is going to be a recession and rising unemployment and potentially a financial crisis, either one that has already happened or one that is rapidly approaching. And so I think Powell is going to choose what he believes to be the lesser of the two evils. And I think he's going to pick fighting recession and propping up financial markets and monetizing government debt so the Treasury doesn't have to default. I think the Fed is going to pick that over inflation. And so unlike the pivot that we got with Volcker back in 1982, where Volcker pivoted after a victory in his fight against inflation, Powell is going to pivot despite defeat. Inflation is going to win. And so when we go back to 0% interest rates or whatever we do, and when we go to QE5, which is going to be launched, I don't think the Fed is going to shrink its balance sheet very much. It's going to shrink it less than it did last time it tried to do it, which is an impossible task given the bubble that it's inflated. I think when the Fed goes back to stimulus and creating inflation, when inflation is maybe double or triple or quadruple that 2% target, the markets are going to react very differently than how they reacted in the past. Because in the past, the Fed was able to justify all this cheap money because they said we don't have enough inflation. We're still below target. Well, when they go back to this stimulus, when inflation is triple or more their target, the markets aren't going to buy it. And so I think all the inflation that they are going to have to create in order to stimulate the economy out of this recession is going to ignite a powder keg. We already have an inflation problem, and Powell's going to pour all this gasoline on it. And so we're going to see inflation moving up to a much higher level, even though it's already very high. In fact, it's probably double what the government claims in the CPI. If you want to know what's actually happening to prices, you've got to double what the government tells you, and that's more accurate.
Okay, I want to touch on this pivot here. Remember, the Fed has two mandates: fighting inflation and maximizing the employment side. Now, unemployment has actually fallen yet again to 3.5%. You've actually tweeted about this. You said there was a net loss of full-time jobs in July, actually. All of the net 528,000 jobs added were part-time jobs, most of them low-paying service sector jobs. Now, I mentioned I read some of your juicy tweets. So I actually looked into this myself in the BLS, Peter. A recent jobs report came out. The number of persons employed part-time for economic reasons increased by 303,000 to 3.9 million. So of the 528,000 jobs added, 300,000 were part-time jobs. Now, the Fed's looking at the overall unemployment number, and they're probably thinking, okay, we don't have to fight unemployment right now because it's at an all-time low, right? Is that an accurate statement to make? Is that an accurate reading of the number?
Even if some of those other jobs were full-time jobs, and it's hard to say, but even if they were, they probably went to people who already had another full-time job. Because one thing that we know for this month or last month is that it's a new record. The number of people working two full-time jobs is now at an all-time record high. And why are people having to hold down 2 full-time jobs? Because one isn't enough. That is the problem. This labor market is so weak, workers are being forced to accept huge pay cuts, which is what they're doing. They're getting small increases in their wages, but it's being more than offset by enormous increase in the cost of goods. The cost of living is going up much more than their meager pay raises. And so what a lot of Americans are now forced to do is take another job. And many people that have one part-time job now have 2 or 3 because they can't pay the bills with a single job or even 2 jobs. So this doesn't happen in a strong labor market. In a strong labor market, workers get real wages, raises. They're able to get their boss to increase their pay by more than the increase in the cost of living. But in a weak labor market, workers are forced to work for lower wages, and that is in fact what is actually happening. And meanwhile, labor force participation last month fell to 62.1. That is the low for the year. And in fact, over the last 4 months, even though we've created all these jobs, the number of people in the workforce has gone down. And so that means that all the jobs that were created over the last 4 months were people who already had a job getting another job.
You don't think it's because people found renewed purpose after the pandemic? They just want to work more?
No, well, the data isn't lying. We have fewer people working than we had 4 months ago. You know, Biden claimed that we have a record number of people in the workforce. He was mistaken. He's wrong. We had more people working 4 months ago than we have working now.
Okay, well, by
the way,
Yeah.
the record high for the number of people working is before the pandemic. So even though we've recovered the jobs that we lost prior to the pandemic, it's only because the same people have multiple jobs. We haven't recovered the workers. We still have a lot of workers that were working prior to the pandemic that haven't rejoined the labor force.
Okay, I want to come back to the financial crisis that you mentioned earlier in the interview, but first, another juicy tweet you made. You said that there's no trade-off between inflation and economic growth. Real economic growth increases supply, holding prices down. The problem is that our economy hasn't had real growth thanks to the Fed. It experienced an artificial bubble. To fight inflation, that bubble must be popped. Just going back to the first part of your tweet, Peter, there's no trade-off between inflation and economic growth. The Fed's talking about a soft landing, which is a trade-off between economic growth and inflation. That's not possible?
Well, first of all, we can't have a soft landing because a soft landing means we avoid recession. So by that definition, we've already crashed, or it's a hard landing. But there's no way we can have a soft landing.
We don't know for sure if it's a recession. The definition has been muddled.
Well, I don't care how the politicians want to redefine it. It is what it is. And so, you know, I'm not going to change the meaning of a word just to deny that we're not in something that we're in, that somehow believe that inflation is caused by economic growth. They also think it's caused by too many people working. They think there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation.